Please be seated. Today in this service, we're emphasizing our longings. We're in a series during the season of Lent on the encounters with Jesus. And in each of those encounters, the one who has the encounter with Jesus confronts something about their lives. Something about their life that is a need, or something they need to pay attention to, something that has taken center stage and perhaps does not need to be there, or perhaps something does need to be at center stage and is not in that place. Today, we confront our longings. Because in this service, we also come face to face with Jesus as we read this story, as we meditate on it. And that confrontation, that encounter, causes us to confront what we long for. On our communion table, you will see empty bowls. It is a symbol of our longing. That is, we carry around with us a bowl, and that bowl is empty. And we need to fill that bowl, and we can't just set it down, can't set it aside. That bowl is something that we carry with us. What is the need for that bowl? What is the longing represented by it in your life? Aside from Jesus, the main character in our story today is Zacchaeus. And we learn three things about Zacchaeus. We learn that Zacchaeus is a chief tax collector. And right away that tells us a lot about him. He is despised by everybody as a chief tax collector. Now, we may have some sense of that because probably most of us are not very fond of the Internal Revenue Service and maybe other taxing authorities. Perhaps we would understand what it means to despise a tax collector. There was a bumper sticker I saw that said, "The IRS, we have what it takes to take what you have." We have that image, don't we, of the IRS. Can't quite trust them. You might remember 14, 15 years ago a series of hearings about the Internal Revenue Service and terrible stories people told about being hounded and their lives being turned upside down. And one person who was testifying before the Senate about what had happened in her life said, "The IRS is judge, jury, and executioner, accountable to no one." So we have that sense, don't we, sometimes? Maybe often. But for those in first century Palestine, there was a real hatred of the tax collector that goes beyond anything we can imagine because the Roman system of taxation was completely corrupt. Tax collectors would bid for the job, how much they thought they could collect for Rome. They would make that agreement with Rome, and then they could charge whatever they wanted, backed up by the Roman military, to extort money from the people. And so they would often become very rich, keeping all of the extra for themselves. To say that Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector meant to say that he had no friends, that he had a lot of enemies, that he had nothing but broken relationships in his life. To say that was also to say that he was barred from the synagogue as a traitor to the people, sold out to the occupying forces of Rome. He was a tax collector. He was despised. Secondly, we know he was rich. And that also is another way of saying he enriched himself by impoverishing other people. He was also rich because he was in Jericho. Jericho is a wealthy town. Jericho is a center of trade. Jericho is an important trade route to the lands east of the Jordan. It's a fertile valley, the Jordan Valley. And so, of course he was rich. He was the chief tax collector in Jericho. And then, of course, we learn that he was short. And it's his shortness probably that people know more about that than anything else related to Zacchaeus. We all learned the little song. Many of us learned the little song. Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. He was short. So here's Zacchaeus, a tax collector, despised, dishonest, despicable. Zacchaeus, who could not be trusted by anyone. Zacchaeus, who everywhere he went told lies to enrich himself. Zacchaeus, who had no friends. No one loved him. And he probably had no one to love. Zacchaeus, a despised tax collector. I'll allow Adaramus to say a little more about that. I noticed those of you under a certain height were not applauding at that point. Well, there are three amazing things about this experience, I think. The first is that someone has arranged that song for choir. That we actually had it sung in a service of worship. And that my wife, Susan, who is 5'2", actually sang along with the song. It is a song she despises more than they despised Zacchaeus, I'm sure. And I guess the other thing is I'm actually going to theologize just a bit after that song to say there's one thing in the song that gets it right. And that is that we're all in the same boat, that we're all brothers and sisters, that we all share something in common with Zacchaeus. That's the direction I want to go. Zacchaeus. We're not in the same boat in the sense of what we do for a living. We may not be nearly as underhanded as Zacchaeus was or as unworthy of trust, but we are in a similar place, often in our lives. That place of longing, that place of where we feel like we have boxed ourselves in. Earlier in our series, we met another man in Jericho, the son of Timaeus, a blind man begging by the road. There, boxed in by others, not in a place of his own choosing or in a box of his own making. But Zacchaeus is different. Zacchaeus built the box that he lives in, and he built it board by board, plank by plank. And he has to reside there. And we can imagine there's great longing for Zacchaeus, that Zacchaeus indeed carries around an empty bowl, and it symbolizes that emptiness in his life. He wants it to be full, but he's not quite sure what he's missing or what needs to fill it, and he can't just set it aside. He can't put it down. The bowl is always there. So he has longings. And we know the depth of his longing because Zacchaeus runs to the head of the crowd to see Jesus. In that time and place, in that culture, a man in his position would never run. Jim Fleming gave us that insight when he talks about the prodigal son, that the father in the prodigal son parable Jesus tells runs to greet his son and embraces him. What an undignified thing to do. A man in the position of that father, the head of a household, would never run. But the depth of his love for his son was such that he forgot all of that, forgot himself, forgot who he was, and he ran to embrace his son. That's the depth of God's love for us, Jesus says. For Zacchaeus, the depth of his longing is such that he forgets himself, who he is, his standing in the community, and he runs to the head of the crowd to see Jesus. And not only that, he climbs up a tree. And we know that a man in his position would not climb a tree to see a poor itinerant rabbi who's passing through. But he does that. He forgets himself. So deep is his longing. And Zacchaeus knows who he is. Jesus says later in our text for today that Zacchaeus is a son of Abraham. That is, he's part of the covenant. He knows he was created by God. He knows that God expects him to be a blessing to everyone. That was God's expectation in the covenant with Israel. He knows that. But he knows that he's fallen far short of that. That he has cheated people, that he has stolen from people, that he has intimidated people, and he has used that intimidation to enrich himself at the expense of others. He knows that, and he knows there is this great distance between who God expects him to be and who he really is. And so when people are grumbling about him, when Jesus does eventually associate with him, as we'll see in a moment, and they're saying he has gone in to be with a sinner, Zacchaeus knew he was a sinner. He knew who he was and what he had done. He was, like the Apostle Paul, very much in touch with his own longing and his own need. Paul, in the 7th chapter of Romans, said, I know what's right, but I can't seem to do it, and so I don't do what I should do, and the thing that I should do, I don't do. And then Paul cries out, wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? Zacchaeus knows what that means. And so Zacchaeus climbs a tree to encounter Jesus. And he expects something to happen, but what he doesn't expect is that Jesus will come to him. Now I want to intertwine in the story about Zacchaeus the story of a man that I will call Jeff, that I knew a number of years ago. Jeff was sitting at home one Saturday evening a few weeks before Easter. And Jeff was zoned out in front of the television, had the remote in hand, just kind of staring at the TV. And an ad came on the TV, and you may remember these ads. They were United Methodist ads, and they all ended with open hearts, open minds, open doors, the people of the United Methodist Church. And they all had a message. We used to run those ads pretty intensely during Lent and Advent as a denomination. Jeff saw one of those ads. He had seen them before, but for some reason, on this Saturday night, a few weeks before Easter, the ad really touched him in a way. He began to think about his own life. Jeff, very different from Zacchaeus. Jeff was not a tax collector. He was an entrepreneur. Jeff was not rich. He was comfortable. Jeff was not short. He was probably medium height or tall. But he shared this with Zacchaeus. He, in that moment, really got in touch with the distance between who he knew he was supposed to be, what God expected of him, and who he was. In that moment, somehow, he experienced that kind of distance that Paul experienced and that Zacchaeus experienced. He, in that moment, realized he was holding a bowl that he had been carrying around for a long time, and the bowl was empty, and he couldn't set it aside. He couldn't put it away. He knew that it needed to be filled, but wasn't quite sure with what or how. And so he shocked his wife as they were getting ready for bed. He said, "Why don't we all go to church tomorrow?" And she said, "Oh, okay." She said later she was thinking, it's not Easter. It's not Christmas. Why is he talking about church? But they went. Now, Zacchaeus and Jeff were both in touch with their need, with their longings. Zacchaeus, up the tree, not fully knowing what to expect, but expecting something out of this itinerant teacher, must have been shocked when Jesus came to him. Now, in our tradition, in the larger Christian tradition, and especially in the Methodist tradition, the Wesleyan tradition, we emphasize grace. And when we think about Jesus seeking out Zacchaeus and going to that tree and finding him and desiring to see Zacchaeus even more than Zacchaeus wanted to see him, we can't help but think of the prevenient grace of God that goes to us before we are even aware. It's God at work in our lives, seeking us out, wooing us, yearning to be in relationship with us. And that's what we see in Zacchaeus. He's up a tree, literally and figuratively, as he's trying to figure out what to do with his life. He's in this stuck place. He's helpless to do anything about it. But he does the best he can in at least wanting to see Jesus. And Jesus goes directly to him. It's God seeking us out. I believe with Jeff, that's what was going on. As he sat and he watched that commercial that evening, he had seen the commercials before, but somehow God was at work in his life to say to him, hey, pay attention to this. Pay attention to what's going on with you in your life. This is important. So they ended up going to church, and he came to church with expectation, but not really knowing what to expect, and he certainly got something other than he expected. Because for one thing, they were late. They had to get the kids up, they had to get them dressed, and bathed and dressed and fed and all of that, and by the time they got to the church, we didn't have enough parking at that church, and so they parked 2 blocks away on the curb, and had to walk 2 blocks. And by the time they did all that, they were late for worship. And he said it was so hard to pull open that big wooden door in that church because he didn't know what would happen on the other side. He didn't know whether he'd be welcomed or not. He didn't know what exactly would take place. But they did it. They went in and they were welcomed warmly, and they were ushered almost to the front of the sanctuary, the front third of the sanctuary, which was the last place they wanted to sit. They wanted to be in the back. They wanted to be hidden, but there were no places back there because it was a United Methodist church, and Methodists love to sit in the back. And so they had to move up close to the front. And just as they were getting settled in the seat and the usher made his way to the back, their little boy needed to go to the bathroom. So Jeff had to get up and to walk back down the aisle, take his son to the bathroom, and just as they were coming back in, it was time for the children's moment. And Jeff was ready to sit down, but his wife said, "You need to take him down front." And so he took him down to the front, and he didn't want to stay by himself. And so Jeff said he had to sort of crouch down in the front with the children's sermon going on the whole time. And then finally he got back to his pew. And he said that when he got back, at some point in the worship service, he had this image that came into his mind. And it was the image of Jesus standing in front of him and saying, hey, let's go for a walk and talk a while. Let's go for a walk and talk a while. It just reminds me of the Zacchaeus story, doesn't it? Jesus standing in front of him saying, hey, let's get together. Let's take a walk. Let's talk. Let's sort through things. And I really think that is the prevenient grace of God. It's God at work in his life in this very early moment of his coming to faith. Well, Zacchaeus came down from the tree, and Jesus invited himself to dinner, as Mr. Mark said a while ago. And they went to dinner. That seems like not a very big deal to us, but in that culture, to sit down at table with somebody means reconciliation, friendship. It means you're included. It means you're accepted. In the presence of mine enemies, the psalmist wrote, Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. It's an image of reconciliation. And he sits down at table with Zacchaeus. And what a blessing that is. What he's saying is, Zacchaeus, I forgive you. This is an opportunity to begin again. This is a chance for you to be different. This is an opportunity for you to fill that empty bowl, to fill that empty place of longing in your life. Zacchaeus, it's going to be different. We would call this justifying grace. Just as if I'd never sinned, someone has said, is a good way to remember that. To be justified, to be given a new chance, a second start, a new beginning in your life, to be forgiven, to be reconciled with God, and to be put on the path of reconciliation with other people. That's what happened with Zacchaeus. And it happened with Jeff too. As a matter of fact, it happened over a long period of time for Jeff. This was not instantaneous, but he answered Jesus' call to take a walk and to have a talk. And I mean by that, he decided to join a Bible study group, and he decided to investigate this a little more. And he decided to accept this amazing grace of God in his life. Justification. Justifying grace of God. And it was a new start for him. As it was for Zacchaeus. You remember what Zacchaeus did? Now note, Jesus did not proclaim love for Zacchaeus or agree to have dinner with Zacchaeus after Zacchaeus promised to give half of everything to the poor or to restore everything that he had taken fourfold. Zacchaeus, in response to the love and the grace that he experienced in Jesus, in response to this meal of reconciliation, in response to the forgiveness that he experienced, that's when he said, I'm going to be different. I'm going to give half of everything that I have to the poor. I'm going to restore everything that I've taken fourfold. We don't know the rest of that story, but what we do know is that it probably was not easy for Zacchaeus. Don't you know the next morning when Zacchaeus got up, he began to work on that. He realized how difficult a task that would be. To give half of everything to the poor. To restore everything that he had taken unjustly fourfold. Jeff experienced that same sort of thing. The challenge of living the Christian life. The challenge of reordering his life, placing God and his family at the top of the list, about making family a real priority, about making his faith a priority. He experienced, as we all do, the difficulty of that, but he also experienced the grace of God that we call sanctifying grace. It's God at work in our lives to help us be who God created us to be and who Jesus called us to be, and in fact to follow in Jesus' footsteps in living our lives, as we said a moment ago in the baptism ritual, according to the example of Christ. Ordering our lives in that way. Well, that was tough for Zacchaeus. It was tough for Jeff, you can imagine. But it's by the grace of God that that's made possible. So what we celebrate today is the movement of God's grace in our lives. To fill the empty bowl. not just to fill it for ourselves, but in that process of sanctifying grace, to fill it so that it overflows into good works, so that it overflows into making a difference in our world, so that it overflows in love and grace for other people. What a gift the grace of God is. I think that if Jeff were here today, he would say, Jesus has the power today to extend that grace to you. That the bowl doesn't need to remain empty, but it can be filled to overflowing. At the end of the story, Jesus proclaims, today's salvation has come to this house. And it's at that moment we learn that what we've been witnessing in Zacchaeus' life is this process called salvation. A process that really lasts a lifetime. A process of God working in our lives, throughout our lives. That's the grace of God. It's my prayer for you. I don't know what bowl you've brought with you today. I don't know what bowl you carry that you can't seem to put down, but you can't seem to get filled. I don't know what your longings are. You know that. God knows that. But God's grace is sufficient. Let's bow for prayer. Oh God, through your prophet Isaiah, you said, come now, let us reason together. Though your sins be as scarlet, they will be as white as snow. Though they be like crimson, they will be as wool. Seeking God, help us to know that you seek us before we seek you. And we thank you that you are ever present in our lives. At work, even when we're unaware. Forgiving God, help us to know your forgiveness and the grace that you offer us so perfectly seen in Jesus. We thank you for your grace that enables a new beginning, a new start, a clean slate. Sustaining God, we thank you for your grace that strengthens us to live as you call us to live, that works within our lives to mold us after your will. Gracious God, we give you thanks in Jesus' name. Amen.